I think it's really a real privilege just to follow on from this morning's session and Brené's just incredible work that she shared with us today. So I think really what I'm trying to do today is to share with you, in perhaps as accessible a kind of way, some of the things that popped up throughout Brené's conversation this morning, and also when Bubu was speaking, and it's this idea of decoloniality. And I know it's a really complex subject, and I know it's a really layered and academic subject, and so a lot of my work has been very academic. But I'm going to try today just to kind of sort of open it up. And so I've got kind of about 5 slides where I'm just going to look at decoloniality as a kind of practice, and particularly in relation to fashion. And perhaps we're a good place to start. And I think it's something that in a lot of more current academic work particularly, is this idea of positionality. And it is, where do we speak from? Where are we speaking from? Where do you stand when you share your work? Where do you stand when you engage with the world? This idea of what positions you in this world. So when we speak about positionality, it really is things like age, gender, class, culture. So these are the things, the knowledges, and so René also spoke about the kinds of knowledges that are within us. So one's positionality informs the way in which one faces the world, in which one confronts the world, in which one engages with the world. So that is the one direction that positionality works. But the other direction that positionality works is, how do people read you? How do people acknowledge you? How do people position you? So this idea of positionality is the kinds of relations that we form with each other. How do we get to know one another, and where do we place one another? So how do we listen, or how do we know one another? In terms of age, in terms of culture, in terms of accent, in terms of ways of speaking. And so this is where my work has been really centered, is this role of fashion, and how does fashion do that? So how do you use fashion to communicate, to stake out a position? And some of us have done it very consciously, and some of us have done it less consciously. So some of us, it isn't as clear as a kind of staking out of one's sexuality, of one's culture, of one's personality. So we understand that fashion is a tool, but we also understand that we are read or come to be understood by others through our fashion. So what you wear is also how people come to understand you. So I'm trying to kind of, if that was all that it was, I think we'd kind of sort of like be able to move on. But actually, it is a lot more complicated than that. And maybe, so just to maybe sort of start to complicate that, what is it about fashion that speaks? And if we come to understand that fashion speaks, how do these fashion objects gather their meanings? How is it that a t-shirt comes to mean something? And then how does a t-shirt share its meanings? And then how do they lose their social meaning? So how do objects lose their social meaning? And these are really important power relations that start to happen, particularly when things start to change. Because clothing and objects come to mean something through a lineage, through a kind of history of their meaning. And so I know Jackie said earlier on, everybody must just turn off their cameras. And so I was kind of considering that if we had the time, we'd all put our cameras on, but maybe I'm just going to ask you to rather either in the chat box or on a piece of paper if you've got a notebook. Think of something that you're wearing today. And I saw somebody had a peacock, somebody had a head wrap, somebody had a t-shirt, whether it's jewelry, accessories, and try and think of how did that object that you're wearing, how did it get its meaning? How did it get its meaning? How did it come to get its meaning? And then how is that meaning of what you're wearing communicate something about your positionality, something about how it places you in the world? So it could be a t-shirt, it could be a jacket, it could be a shirt. How did it get to carry that meaning? So we talk about these legacies, like how did it get to speak? How does clothing get to speak? So I'm just wondering if you've just made a few notes. Think about a t-shirt or a jacket. How did it get to have that social meaning? And sometimes these lineages of meaning are personal. They're particular to the self. Sometimes they're communal. Sometimes it's part of a subculture or part of cultural. Sometimes these are large and national meanings. And I think this morning, Brené kind of pointed to quite a lot of really important cultural lineages or knowledges and the importance of those. Anyway, I just asked you to kind of keep a note. So fashion carries a positionality. As much as we ourselves come to be, fashion itself has come from a lineage. Fashion has a much longer lineage or place where it has come from. And so this is where things start to get a little bit complicated. Because when we speak about fashion, and particularly in thinking more broadly in terms of creative work, or in terms of political work, or in terms of cultural activism, fashion is incredibly ambiguous. And I mentioned earlier something around power and this relationship to power. And so the first ambiguity lies in this split between when fashion is a noun and when fashion is a verb. So if we stick with this idea that fashion as a noun, in the colonial project, who had fashion and who owned fashion was very much a colonial civilizing project. So the idea that fashion came from Europe or came from colonizers and arrived, and it didn't just happen in South Africa, it happened in Australia, in South America, in Canada. This idea that fashion, the noun, who had fashion and who did not have fashion. So in the same way as who had knowledge of certain kinds of knowledge and who was colonizing tool was around fashion. So this imposition, and Datira, I think you were mentioning a little bit earlier, this imposition of erasure, so the imposition of erasure of indigenous forms of fashion through the colonial project is still evident today, this kind of loss of fashion. So fashion as a noun, referring to a very particular interpretation. However, if we start to think of fashion as a verb, to fashion, we can all fashion, to make, and we can invert that logic or invert that term to empower a different set of practices. The first sort of distinction between fashion as a verb and a noun, but kind of taking it a little bit further in terms of how fashion is sometimes understood when particularly when you're working in a project or in a field, and the kind of question, so you're working with fashion, but it is just fashion. It is just a material thing. It is just materials. But these materials carry meaning that are incredibly loaded, and they're incredibly constructed. So in the same way that our questions of culture or questions of gender, these are social constructs, fashion is also a social construct. So when we take a leather jacket, and in this morning's examples where Brené was showing the sort of Western shirts, and then kind of to shift the meanings of those, to remake the meaning within those garments. So the Slum Studio is also based in Ghana. So again, working with secondhand found objects, secondhand objects from the market. But I'm interested to kind of push this a little bit further where it comes to something like the Herero matriarch on the right-hand side, and the kind of way in which that meaning of her dress shifted through particular acts of conquest. So the Herero in Namibia, in the sort of German War, it was at the time of the German War that this kind of colonial fashion was imposed. But at the end of the war, where the Herero woman then occupied the dress of the colonizers to make it their own, not as a sign of kind of defeat, but as a sign of conquest and an occupying and a becoming, so shifting the meaning of that dress. So even though it is a material object, it has the power to shift meaning. And so it came through in terms of some of the questions this morning around literacies and these kinds of languages, these literacies, and clothing in the same way, or fashion in the same way, is a language. And so when we think about what we're wearing and what kind of language is what we're wearing, what kind of language is it speaking with? And so much of the language of fashion is still determined by a very particular sort of colonial or global north language, the way in which we understand a suit, the way in which we understand a tie, the way in which we understand a t-shirt is a particular kind of language. And can we start to change those languages? Can we start to think of different languages of clothing, of fashion. Sometimes through this embodiment, sometimes through occupying these clothes differently, you can start to change the language of that clothing. The reason I'm kind of sort of sitting with this tension around fashion is that I think so much of the media around fashion perpetuates this thing that fashion is fixed. It always changes. I mean, that's one thing that they always say. It changes, but in some kind of way that its meanings are quite fixed. And yet there's this incredible fluidity that is possible. But I think it is incredibly important to know the intentions with which you are speaking. Where do you want clothing or your fashion item, particularly in your creative project, where do you want it to speak from? What kind of language do you want it to use? Where are these languages? Where is the possibility of these languages? And this is where the kind of decolonial work starts to come in. And Bubu mentioned it. And so in a very, very short thesis on decoloniality. And so the image that I'm sharing here is Lesiba's Reinstitute project, and some of you might be familiar with the project. So I'll just stick with the image a little bit. And it was a project at Zeitmacher where Lesiba looked at the man's suit, the role of the suit in terms of masculine identities, and how do we start to reimagine the suit? How do we start to rethink the suit differently, to have a different lineage, to have a different embodiment, to speak a different language? And so this idea of decolonizing the suit, to start to try and shift the way in which how it is understood and where it is speaking from. So there is a very important text by the decolonial thinkers Walter Mignolo and Rolando Vazquez, and I'll share some of these details a little bit later. And they talk about a three-part method, which they define as a kind of decolonial aesthesis. So something you're probably also thinking like, so aesthesis in this particular use of the word is what Mignolo and Vazquez are presenting as a kind of pushback against aesthetics. So aesthetics is what it looks like, and it's very much a Western philosophy of surface kind of presentation and the truth. So decolonial aesthesis is a kind of broader sensing. So it's not just what it looks like, but also what it feels like, where it comes from, what it is saying, what it is knowing. Decolonial aesthesis, they are proposing a three-part method, and I think this is just really important to kind of sort of take this in, if anything, from decoloniality and fashion, this kind of really quite important three-part method. And it, perhaps maybe sort of to take it back to the thing that you spoke about, or what you were wearing. The first most important step when thinking about fashion and coloniality is, can one identify its coloniality? And by that, can one identify the colonial impact? So why would a t-shirt carry a particular set of meanings or why does a suit carry a particular set of meanings? So to be able to identify the coloniality of a colonial origin or the colonial impulse, whose meaning system is being perpetuated by that suit, or whose meaning system is being perpetuated by a particular fashion history. So identifying coloniality is the first part of this method. Purely identifying it won't get us very far. And so what's really important is to start to think about, so what? So what about, you know, the fact that the suit is incredibly invasive and pervasive in a way, in terms of how particular kinds of identities are performed. So what about that? So the impact, so to acknowledge the impact of that. If we think of fast fashion, it is another one. You know, fast fashion as a kind of colonial colonization of a particular aesthetic that dominates sort of global fashion. And the greatest impact is this, to acknowledge, is this erasure. So what is it erased? What is this colonial fashion erased or ignored, or where its sacrifices been? And very often they have been in terms of other kinds of knowledges, other kinds of ways of knowing, or ways of making, or ways of wearing. Second acknowledgement in this process would be to sort of say, okay, so what? So how has that erasure impacted? And then the third part of this method is really to start to think about voicing or making evident or making visible alternatives. And that is really our role as creatives in thinking about how we can start to make visible other knowledges, we can start to make visible other histories, we can start to make visible through our creative work other kinds of aesthetic lineages or other kinds of fashion ideas. So it doesn't remove coloniality. I think that's the important thing, is to acknowledge the coloniality, but you know, to push back and to fight and to kind of try and erase all coloniality in the process is pretty upstream. It's pretty impossible. But to start to witness or make visible or make audible other knowledges. So I know it's abstract, but it's an incredibly important quality of fashion, that it speaks. And I think we all understand that fashion has the capacity to act like a language, and for us to start to think, how is it speaking? How does it speak? How does fashion speak? How does it speak back? And what kind of languages is it employing? So part of my work is with the African Fashion Research Institute, but I am also part of a network called the Research Collective for Decoloniality in Fashion. And on a monthly basis, we select a reading and we engage in a reading around decoloniality and fashion. And so in this particular, this was last month, we invited Rolanda Vasquez into a dialogue. And over the last year, I've been working with Siviwe on a number of projects, and we quite regularly we go back to a particular text of Rolando's around listening, around deep listening and what does it mean to listen. And so I'm going to play you just a short excerpt from that conversation where Rolando is responding to Sibiwe in this session.
So I was listening to Sibiwe's audio, and well, maybe just picking up from this part, she's that you played, Angela. I think there are several questions there that are important. One is the question of speaking back and the difference maybe about speaking back in two ways I can think of these. One is the risk of speaking back to power. And then this is, I think, something that is in other statements in the audio, the risk of when you are speaking back, just being speaking to power and then becoming again encircled by that logic of power that we are contesting. And where we are not speaking back in the sense of speaking back in time, like speaking back from what has been impossible to speak about. So I think there's two ways of speaking back. One will be the speaking back as the contestation of power, as resistance. And the other is speaking back as being able to speak anew, to speak through that erasure, through that silence. That is something that often power cannot listen and will never listen to, that we also need to do. So I'm remembering here, obviously, the words of Maria Lugones that always invite us to go beyond resistance. So one thing is to speak back to power as resistance, and another thing is how can we speak back? And I think these are deeper questions that are at the core of what I feel in the engagement of Sibiwe, that is, with whose words are we speaking? To whom are we speaking? And often when we spend our energy speaking back to power, we are spending our energy towards power. So that to whom are we speaking is to them or to the system that we are trying to fight back. And of course, it's necessary. I'm not saying it's not necessary, but that's not the horizon. That is not what we are, right? The being against is not who we are. So I think it would be really beautiful to speak of this speaking back in two moments. One is the moment of critique of power, and the other would be the moment of re-existence. That is a term we use in Coloniality.
So these possibilities in which you engage. Sorry, Kumo, did you want to come in here?
Oh no, just like when you're done, obviously, when you're done your speech and everything, I just want to comment on everything, yeah.
Okay, great. And so these words that Rolando is sharing and trying to think through your creative projects, and that's what I'm trying to pull together here in this very short presentation that we have. Let me just go to the next one. That in a sense you have a responsibility in putting together something that pulls sustainability, fashion, your positionality, and the digital, and this kind of opportunity to speak, to say something with fashion, And so this becoming conscious of how fashion speaks is an incredibly important tool to consider. So I'm just going to take you through about 5 sort of concepts. I'm not going to try and explain the concepts. I'm going to just take you through and point you in the kind of direction where you could maybe look to take these ideas a bit further. And I think we can share these slides at the end of the session. I'm just going to take you through 5 concepts, and then I'm going to take you through about 5 strategies to kind of work. And so the first one is this particular text, which is Decolonial Aesthesis. And they point to that decoloniality is at once the unveiling of the wound and the possibility of healing. So the unveiling of the wound, the colonial impact, it makes the wound visible and tangible. It voices the scream. It's a really, really, really powerful way that at the same time decolonial aesthesis moves towards the healing, the recognition and the dignity. And that is what even Renee was saying. It's about the dignity, a dignified life, the dignity of those practices that have been written out of the canon of modern aesthetics. So it's a really important shift in thinking about how and what is being spoken or conveyed. So at the same time that you want to make visible, you also want to ensure the kind of healing possibilities. And to Nico's beautiful work here. This is a really important key reading. And then very often in reading sort of about decoloniality, we come across this coloniality modernity, this kind of sort of, there is no modernity without coloniality. So the way in which we experience or know the modern world, the way in which we know the present. With decolonial thinking, the history of progress or civilization, as we call it, cannot be disconnected from the history of enslavement, of plantation, of extraction. So even if we think about, you know, a lot of the conversation that you might have had over the last 2 days is this role of the fashion system in damaging the earth, in creating pollution, in creating unethical employment. So how do we revision? How do we become sober? So this particular, what Angela Janssen calls a binomial, that you cannot think about modernity without thinking about coloniality. And where I'm very particularly interested in how it sits in fashion, but it sits in economic systems, it sits in architecture, it sits in ways of marketing, advertising, product development, all those things. So modernity, the way in which it is linked to coloniality. So it is everywhere. It is evasive, but it is everywhere. So it's to become conscious of that. So Angela's quite important essay on that. And then very often when we're thinking about fashion, we're thinking about, is it fashion? Is it dress? Is it style? And for a very long time, the West had fashion and the rest had dress. So when we spoke about African fashion, it was African dress or traditional dress, in the same way that the West was modern and everything else was tradition. So it's to explode the sort of possibility of that kind of binary or that kind of hierarchy of who had fashion and who didn't have fashion. So Carol Tulloch is a really good well-known author, and she's curated an exhibition called Black British Style, and she kind of says, just become aware when these terms are used, when is dress used, when is fashion used, and to consider the way in which these terms can come to mean different things. So quite a nice reading as well, just in terms of sort of from Black to post-Black, the way in which Blackness and fashion is also being theorized. This is quite an old paper. It's from about 10 years ago. And then my really sort of favorite interview with Okwi and Weasel. And Okwi and Weasel is a curator of Design Africa. And in this interview, it's really important provocation that he's putting forward. And I think, following on from Renee this morning, and the kind of richness, the kind of intelligence that she's referring to in terms of African intelligence and African craft intelligence, is to kind of rethink the way in which the words that we use to describe skill, intelligence, knowledge, literacies is really important. And so what Okwi in this, it's a short interview, it's about 15 minutes. What he proposes in this interview is that we start to invert the logic of these concepts, to shift the logic where recycling or remodeling or impoverished or informal are actually, they are the future. They are far more sustainable and they are far more desirable than the systems of make and destroy. So to begin to rethink the way in which we think about and speak about design on the African continent. So really important interview. So I would highly guarantee that, I mean, I would highly recommend that you just listen to that one. And then how fashion is built on sacrifice, or the fashion system that we have come to know has been built on sacrifice, and this relationship. And I think for all of your projects that you're dealing with in terms of sustainability, is to become aware of the sacrifice. You know, where are these sacrifices? What are these sacrifice zones of fashion? And I think you've seen some of the environmental damage, you've seen some of the comments around secondhand clothing and the kinds of sacrifice zones that are at the receiving end of this fast fashion system. So Sandra Neeson is quite an important essay around sort of the kind of embedded racism that still sits within this fashion system. So really important reading. And then this last one that I'm just sharing here, and I think a really important one, because you're dealing with, all of you are dealing in a digital realm, but you're dealing with the objects. You're dealing with objects of sorts. And when we talk about fashion, technically it's an object. And how do objects get to speak, and how do objects carry kind of agency? So Wayne Modest is a head of the museum at the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. He's also a really important critical thinker. And he's saying, you know, how important it is to rewrite histories of objects, to rewrite these histories of objects, to re-narrate a different history. Because there's so many of these fashion objects, there's a single history. So many of the objects in museums have been defined by a very single narrative And what does it mean to rewrite new histories, to rethink new histories, and a kind of thinking about the sort of plurality of histories. So it really, also it's about a 15-minute, interview. So also really an important one to think about how objects carry powerful story, particularly in museums. And then just to kind of sort of trying to keep an eye on my time, just to kind of finish off just these kind of 5 strategies that I'm sort of thinking would maybe be useful for you to kind of start to look at. And Bayo Komolafe is an interesting philosopher, mystic, post-activist, and a really, really, really brilliant mind, but just trying and queer the kind of future thinking. I mean, we had a lot of this idea around Afrofuturism, but kind of fixed on some of these Afrofuturist ideas are kind of fixed on a Western perception of an Afrofuturist. And what is it to imagine different kinds of futures? And Bubu talked about imagining different kinds of futures as well. You know, how do we work with what we have to think about different kinds of futures, and how do we imagine in completely ways that we don't know? So some really nice work with Bayo's sort of practices. This is the reading that Sibiwe and I have worked with quite a bit, Decolonial Listening. It's an interview with Rolando and Zoe, and just how do practices of decolonial listening help us to move towards more ethical relation to the world and to others. I've just shared Jade's Vogue project, where she's kind of sort of taken a Vogue from the 1950s and kind of inserted images of Black South Africa into that Vogue to evidence other kinds of voices, to evidence other kinds of histories that have been written out of fashion histories. So really important, how do we listen to that which has been erased? A really important reading as well. I wrote about a particular museum practice, you know, curating fashion. How does curation, how when we curate, can we start to invoke other kinds of remembering? How do we invoke another kind of remembering? How do we invoke other languages into spaces like exhibitions or into the media? So I wrote about that exhibition at Salzmacher in thinking about how do we invoke other kinds of rememberings. And then some of you that are kind of looking at a much broader kind of question of sustainability, the more than human intervisions, way in which we think about our projects, the way in which we think about our work. It's very often from a very anthropocentric point of view, very much from a human point of view. And what does it mean to start to think about your project, or to start to think about the way we make clothes, wear clothes, engage in practices? When we start to think about how would the perspective of your project or your work be seen from another entity? How would the river relate to your work? How would a river relate? How would a river sense or get an impact from your work? And so starting to think about, to expand the way in which we relate to the world. The Curating Institute, I keep coming back to it, because it's just an incredible set of examples of listening beyond just a single way of seeing the world. So thinking about ancestors as kind of being involved in the way in which we make things, the way in which we express projects. So that if you can envisage a perspective from another entity, other species in relation to your project. Think about your own project, and maybe if you want to share it with your partner after lunch or during lunch. And then just a really exciting example. Some of you might know their work, Low Def Film Factory, the Subterranean Imprint archive. So I'm just sharing this as a kind of digital. I think the digital, and this is maybe why I'm ending with this one, is I think that the digital allows for decolonial voicing. It allows for these kind of revisiting spaces, revisiting histories, revisiting, reinserting new kinds of narratives into the ways in which we know the world, or the ways in which history has been written. So it's this incredibly important and powerful project. It's about the possibility of undoing that displacement from history to define what can become history and what can become world. And so I think it might be quite nice to be able to open this up for some questions.